comment about power and institutional imbalance in global health. Can you explain to us how that came about, the imbalance in the global health
yes.
In terms of power and institutions?
Yes, thanks, Segun. Power, I'll define in this context as the capacity to dictate the terms of a debate, to frame the way an issue is seen, to shape the way choices are presented, and then to shape the leeway that people have or do not have to make choices. And the historical underpinning of the current power asymmetry dates back to the pre-colonial and colonial eras, because there was a convergence of three forces. The first force was, of course, military. Before you can colonize the people, in most parts, you need to have a superior military force to subjugate them, such as what happened in the old Benin Empire, or what happened in Kenya, what happened in Southern Africa, or in East Asia. I mean, pick your region. It's almost always variants of the same. The second was an interaction between that military power on the one hand and technical knowledge on the other hand. That technical knowledge came from that network of schools of tropical medicine or schools of public health that I mentioned earlier. So if you take the case of the Congo, King Leopold II set up this institute, tropical medicine in Antwerp, and they were going to train doctors and nurses to go and work in Belgian Congo. Belgian Congo is the size of Western Europe. So one man declared the country to be his own personal property by force of arms, and then merged it with health workers. So it's this combination of military power and the technical expertise that laid the foundation for the current asymmetry that we now see. But it does not explain all of it. What explains the remainder is the active abdication of responsibility by many leaders of countries in the global south, especially by many leaders of African countries themselves. And let me give you an example, then I turn it back to you. In my experience, several times, in many countries actually, when I ask counterparts, your economy is growing, how come you are not putting more money into your own health services? Then they say, look, Soji, we're not stupid. We know that all we need to do is nothing. Then those Europeans and Americans who love us more than we love ourselves will convene replenishment meetings, raise billions of dollars, and these programs will continue. So it's an active abdication of responsibility and active collaboration in perpetuating dependency. That is what is going on. Back to you, Segun. Hi, Segun, can you hear me?
Can you guys hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, sorry. So my question was, in terms of foreign aid for health, you mentioned that they're being gained by actors in the global north and the global south. Can you explain to us how this works, and why do you think it's not desirable at this point in time?
Right. Let's unpack it. I started speaking about this on the part of actors in global south. And I will start with that because I think that is really where the responsibility lies. As a country's economy grows, the capacity to finance their own health services grows as well. But many times we do not see countries stepping up. We don't see governments stepping up to increase public financing for their own health services for a number of reasons. One, in many of them, the tax to GDP ratio, tax revenue to GDP ratio is very low. So they're not making a serious enough effort to collect their own local revenues. The revenues that they've collected, they're not making sufficient effort to allocate a sufficient amount to health services, even to priority health services. And then, of course, in what they allocate, there is substantial corruption in many of the settings. So all of these are internal issues, okay? A second aspect is that when the current architecture, broadly speaking, the locus of accountability largely does not lie in the capital cities of the low and lower middle income countries, especially in Africa. The locus of accountability lies outside. And that is very comfortable for those leaders in African countries who do not want to take responsibility in the first instance. So that is the gaming that is going on there. It's related to what I said, that look, they know that if they don't put up their own finances, then you will have all these outside entities doing replenishment on CNN, and they will continue to finance health services in those countries. Now, let's go over to the global north. Why the gaming? Remember, all of these take place in a political setting. And first, it is a lot more attractive to put money into short-term gains and for politicians to take photographs with photogenic brown babies that will be on the front cover of Time magazine or Newsweek or whatever, and saying you are doing good. So that gives immediate short-term gratification. A second one is that their contributions to these financing institutions give them substantial political control over what goes on in those countries, in the low and lower middle income countries. A third factor, and this needs to be said, is that when leaders in some of the global north countries, when they try to do things differently, some of the northern NGOs will excoriate them. If, for example, they say, look, the African countries themselves should really be putting up more money, and we are going to cut back on what we put into it, they will be excoriated by northern NGOs. The UK is a case in point. As they decided to cut their foreign aid, there has been a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth over that. I think that's probably a good thing, actually. Let them cut it. Let the countries become more responsible for their own affairs. Finally, in the case of the USAID, there's a very perverse incentive in that the bulk of what USAID does goes through a handful of US-based contractors who then go into the countries to deliver services, and therefore they undermine or supplant what should be done by the nationals themselves. And when some things are going well, if they go against the perceived selfish institutional interests within USAID sabotages or undermines those. A case in point, which is in the public domain, is the Affordable Medicines Facility for Malaria, which I led. It was evaluated and the evaluation was published in The Lancet. So I'm not sharing with you any secret here. It worked, but for it to continue, it was going counter to the preferred approach of USAID, which is to send US contractors to the countries. It was going to empower the countries themselves. And therefore, USAID bullied the Global Fund into shutting it down. That is what happened. So in fact, USAID undermined progress in malaria in the countries themselves. That is the reality that we face. So you can see how these incentives weigh against how they come about. Finally, the question of replenishment. You know, there was a recent Global Fund replenishment last week. And let's be clear, the Global Fund has done many good things. I really think we must acknowledge that. Okay? At the same time, we must ask ourselves, is this replenishment going to go on forever? Which one would be the last replenishment? So the challenge is, maybe this should be the last replenishment. The focus now should be on winding down so that by the year 2030, the Global Fund business model as we currently know it, Gavi's business model as we currently know it, should end. and the country should take over responsibilities for their own basic services. Back to you.
Right, thanks, Soji. My last question to you will be, at the end of your book, you made reference to that recently, a better future is possible. So can you explain to us what that meant? About a better future is possible in global health issues concerning Africa and probably the rest of the world?
Yes, I can. I have had an extraordinarily privileged career. I want to say that, and I choose those words carefully, extraordinarily privileged career in being able to work practically all over the world. So I've observed and learned very closely what tends to work, what does not tend to work, and the fact that, there are variations across and within countries. But one of the factors that is often understated among technocrats when they're talking about burden of disease and human resources, etc., one of the factors that is often understated or overlooked is seriousness of purpose. And that comes with serious leadership. And it means having the leadership capacity to actually envisage a better future, to self-emancipate, to declare that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, our country is going to be substantially better than it is, and we're going to give it what it takes. In those countries that have made tremendous progress over periods of, say, 5 to 10 years, that invariably has been a decisive factor in my experience. However, in many of the countries, low and lower middle income countries in Africa, permission to speak frankly,